Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, Chapter 22, The Teutonic Collapse. And from the charge they drew, as mountain waves from wasted lands sweep back to ocean blue. By Scott in Marmion. Before the war it had seemed incredible that such terrors and slaughters, even if they began, could last more than a few months. After the first 2 years it was difficult to believe that they would ever end. We seemed separated from the old life by a measureless gulf. The adaptive genius of man had almost habituated him to the horrors of his new environment. Far away shone a pale star of home and peace, but all around the storm roared with unabated and indeed increasing fury. Year after year, every optimism had been discredited, every sober hope cast down, and the British nation had doggedly resigned itself to pursue its task without inquiry when the end would come. In the circles of government, where so many plans had to be made for more than a year ahead, this mood formed the subconscious foundation of our thoughts. Ultimate victory seemed certain, but how it would come and whether it would come in 1919 or in 1920 or later were inquiries too speculative to pursue amid the imperious needs of each day. Still less would anyone dare to hope for peace in 1918. Nevertheless, when from time to time the mental eye fell upon these puzzles, this question immediately presented itself. Would Germany collapse all of a sudden as she had done after Jena? Or would she fight it out to the bitter end like the French under Napoleon or the Confederates under Lee? The Great War came when both sides were confident of victory. Would it continue after one side was sure it had no hope? Was it in the German nature, so valiant yet at the same time so logical, to fight on in revengeful despair? Should we have a year of battle on the Rhine, the march to Berlin, the breaking up of the armies in the open field, the subjugation of the inhabitants? Or would there be some intense nervous spasm, some overwhelming and almost universal acceptance of defeat and all that defeat involved? We had always fancied it would be Jena, but all our plans were for a long-drawn alternative. Certainly the highest interests of Germany, once all hope of victory was closed, required the orderly retreat of the greater part of her armies to the Antwerp-Meuse line and thence to the German frontier. To secure this at all costs became, after the Battle of August 8 and the conclusions drawn from it by the rulers of Germany, the paramount duty of soldiers and statesmen, and of all parties and classes. Moreover, such a retreat could assuredly have been accomplished, provided the decision was immediate. Apart from all the methods of delaying a pursuit which tactics and strategy suggest, the Germans possessed at this time a simple mechanical device, the full use of which would with certainty have gained them a breathing space until the spring of 1919. They had developed time fuses for exploding mines or shells, which could be regulated to retard the explosion not merely for days or weeks, but actually for many months. It would therefore have been possible for the retreating invaders to have sown the roads and railways behind them with mines and buried shells, so that they would be continually destroyed day after day, a fresh and inexhaustible series of explosions at points and moments which their pursuers could never foresee. The only method of dealing with a railway thus mined would be to build an entirely new line out of such material as could be salvaged alongside the original. It would therefore not have been possible for the Allied armies to advance to the German frontiers until they had reconstructed the whole intervening railway system. This could certainly not have been completed before the end of the year. Not till then could the process of dragging forward the ponderous mass of material necessary to mount a grand offensive have even been begun. There might therefore have been gained for Germany a period of perhaps 6 months before the full strength of the Allied armies could have been brought to bear upon her frontier and before she was exposed to actual invasion. The time was sufficient for strong positions to be selected and prepared, and for the whole remaining resources of the nation to be marshaled in defense of its territory. But far more important than any military advantage was the effect which Germany, by admitting defeat and withdrawing completely from France and Belgium, would have produced upon the cohesion and driving power of the Allies. The liberation of the soil of France was the dominating impulse which held the French people to the war. The rescue of Belgium was still the main rallying point of the British war resolve. Had Germany therefore removed both these motives, had she stood with arms in her hands on the threshold of her own land, ready to make a defeated peace, to cede territory, to make reparation, ready also, if all negotiation were refused, to defend herself to the utmost, and capable of inflicting 2 million casualties upon the invader, it seemed, and seems, almost certain that she would not have been put to the test. The passion for revenge ran high, and stern was the temper of the Allies, but retribution, however justified, would not in the face of real peace offers have been in itself a sufficient incentive to lead the great war-wearied nations into another year of frightful waste and slaughter. In the lull and chill of the winter, with the proud foe suing for terms and with all his conquests already abandoned, a peace by negotiation was inevitable. Even in this last phase, Germany need not have placed herself in the appalling position of yielding to the discretion of those upon whom she had inflicted the utmost injuries of hate. Many factors and influences were no doubt simultaneously at work upon those who still ruled Germany. But it is probable that the last chance was lost for a very inadequate reason. The German headquarters could not make up its mind to face the consequences of a swift and immediate retreat. Foch is reported to have said at the end of August, pointing to the war map, "This man," the Germans, "could still escape if he did not mind leaving his luggage behind him." The immense masses of munitions and war stores of all kinds which the Germans had in 4 years accumulated in France and Belgium became a fatal encumbrance. The German staff could not bear to sacrifice them. Their railways soon became congested with mountainous impedimenta. Meanwhile, the supreme policy of the state was paralyzed, and the hard-strained fighting front began to quiver and rock and crack. It is possible in these pages to do little more than mention the series of great and bloody battles and other events by which the German armies were now to be driven out of France and Belgium and the German Empire into collapse, unconditional surrender, and internal revolution. The victory of August 8 was no sooner ended than both Foch and Haig sought to renew the attack. But some divergence arose upon the method and direction. Foch's directive of August 10 prescribed the immediate advance of Rawlinson's 4th British and Debeney's 1st French armies towards the Somme in the general direction of Ham. The 3rd French army was ordered to prolong the attack and profit by the advance of the 1st. And Haig was directed to launch at the earliest moment the British 3rd Army, Byng lying northward of the 4th, in an offensive towards Bapaume and Péronne. Haig had other ideas. He did not consider a further immediate advance towards the Somme by Rawlinson and Debeney practicable. The hostile artillery fire, he said, had greatly increased. The enemy had established themselves in their old front line of 1914–15, which was still in good order and well wired. The ground was broken and unsuitable for tanks. At least 16 German divisions were holding this sector of the front. In these circumstances and after personal inspection, Haig directed that the attack should be postponed until the heavy guns could be brought forward and a full artillery battle mounted. He was, however, in complete accord with the attack of the British Third Army, and had in fact, upon his own initiative, given orders to General Byng before the issue of Foch's directive of the 10th. He now planned to use the right of the British First Army, Horn, as well. Foch reiterated his instructions on August 14. He saw no need to delay the Rawlinson-Debeny frontal attack till Byng could participate. He had not considered the possibility of using Horn. Haig continued to refuse to attack until his artillery preparation was complete. Nothing, he said, had happened to cause him to alter his opinion. He declined to change his orders to either of the armies in question. Meanwhile, he was rapidly and secretly transferring his reserves to Byng and reinforcing Horn with the fresh and powerful Canadian Corps. In short, Foch called for a continuance of the frontal attack south of the Somme, and Haig insisted on opening a new and wider battle to the north, on the front Monchy-Le Preux-Miramont. The difference between the two plans was fundamental. A conference was held at Sarcousse on the 15th. Haig adhered to his intentions, and, though observing a most friendly tone, emphasized his sole responsibility to his government and fellow citizens for the handling of the British forces. Foch saw no headway could be made, and submitted. In his directive issued after the conference, he accepted the British plan and its argument. But he withdrew forthwith the 1st French Army from Sir Douglas Haig, and from noon on August 16 it reverted to the command of General Pétain. Haig may have exaggerated the resisting powers of the Germans south of the Somme, on the front Roye-Chaulnes. But his reasons were as solid as his refusal, and the event proved most fortunate. On August 21, the 3rd British Army began the important Battle of Bapaume. Reinforced by 100 tanks and striking south-southeastward over country not unsuited, as would have been the crater fields of the Somme, to the operations of these sovereign weapons, General Byng pressed back the German line. The German 17th Army, on whom the onset fell, was disposed 3 miles behind, a false front on the Gouraud model. This army counterattacked along the whole line on the 22nd, but the British, having themselves warily engaged at first only a part of their forces, strongly reinforced their assault, beat off the counterattack, and maintained their forward movement. Albert was recovered on the 22nd, and on the 23rd Haig was able to order a general advance on a 33-mile front. The battle was unrelentingly contested, but the British progress was continuous. On the 26th, the right of the British First Army from Arras intervened and added another 7 miles to the breadth of the attack, which thus became the longest unbroken front of any offensive battle yet fought in the West. The Fourth Army was also by now in motion again. That same day, yielding to the pressure from the north, the Germans retired from Roye and fell back to the line of the Somme. Thus, the immediate objective which Marshal Foch demanded, and would have sought through a frontal attack of the 4th British Army, was gained automatically by the attack of the 3rd. The ruins of Bapaume were retrieved on the 29th. From Péronne to Noyon, the Germans stood fast, but on the night of August 30 to 31, the 2nd Australian Division, by a remarkable feat of arms, captured Mont Saint-Quentin, the quay of Péronne, and thus compromised the whole of the river line. Péronne changed hands again on September 1. On the 2nd, the left of the British First Army came into the battle, and with the Canadian Corps and the British 4th Division, after a bloody conflict, broke through in the north the strong system of entrenchments known as the Drocourt-Quéant switch. Whereupon the Germans abandoned the whole line of the Somme, and from the Oise River to the Sensee retreated towards the Hindenburg line. This great British drive may be said to have ended on September 3, by which date the three British armies, and particularly the Third Army, had advanced on their wide fronts an average of 20 miles, and had captured 53,000 German prisoners and 470 German guns. The German movements, not only during this battle, but till the end of the war, resembled those of a squad of soldiers trying to align themselves by their right, and kept in a continual shuffle by the fact that their right-hand man was himself thrust violently backward by British pressure, every time they tried to take up their correct position. Mongin's 10th Army had meanwhile pressed with increasing force northeast through Soissons, and although neither the scale nor the results of his operations were so large as those of the British, the double movement was followed by the general retreat of the German centre. Thus the rest of the 4th British Army and the 1st and 3rd French armies on its right moved forward abreast without heavy losses, and by September 3 the Allied front stood along a line running almost north and south from below Douai to the gates of La Fère. The success of the British attacks exceeded Foch's imperious expectations, and with a magnanimity not always exhibited by great commanders, he was unrestrained in his approval. He sent General Duncan to tell Sir Douglas Haig that the operation of the British Army in August and the early part of September would serve as a model for all time. But these operations were by no means at an end. It was galling to the British headquarters, justly conscious of the predominant part which our armies were beginning to play in these great successes, to find the credit ascribed by their own cabinet and public opinion to Marshal Foch. The part the Prime Minister had played in establishing unity of command led him unconsciously to dwell upon the brilliant conceptions of the Generalissimo, and to view only in a half-light the potent forward heave of the British Army, without which the results would have been mediocre. The press and public at home followed the lead thus given, and the prevailing impressions during these months, and never since effectually corrected, was that after many disasters and much mismanagement, an extraordinary genius had obtained the supreme command and had almost instantaneously converted defeat into victory. Care has been taken in this account to describe some of the splendid decisions on which the fame of Marshal Foch is founded, but this in no way diminishes the services in this campaign of the British Commander-in-Chief. His armies bore the lion's share in the victorious advance, as they had already borne the brunt of the German assault. Foch took a wider survey because he had a higher sphere. It was Haig's duty to take a more restricted view. Act well thy part, there all the honor lies. But nevertheless, as has been and will be shown, on more than one cardinal occasion, Haig, by strenuous insistence, deflected the plans of the Supreme Commander with results which were glorious. And ever his shot-pierced divisions, 5 times decimated within the year, strode forward with discipline, with devotion, and with gathering momentum. Reaction from the mood and fashion at home led the British headquarters into some disparagement of the French contribution to the final advance. In this they were as far from the truth in one direction as their own government in the other. In the victorious period from July to November 11, the French suffered no less than 531,000 casualties themselves, and inflicted 414,000 upon the enemy. That an army and a nation engaged at their full strength from the beginning of the war, which had sustained 700,000 casualties in the first few weeks and nearly 3 million in the first 3 years, should have been capable of so noble an effort at the end, will ever command the admiration and gratitude of their ally. None of the British authorities, military or civilian, at home or in France, was induced by these remarkable victories to predict an early end of the war. General Headquarters, Sir Henry Wilson, the Imperial War Cabinet, the Prime Minister, all proceeded rigorously upon the belief that another most severe campaign would be necessary in 1919. For this, every preparation continued to be made on the largest scale by the Ministry of Munitions. The War Cabinet were concerned lest Haig should be drawn by the success of his army into enterprises beyond the strength of troops who had suffered so much. The Hindenburg Line might well, they feared, not without excuse, become the scene of another Passchendaele. The state of our manpower, with men of 50 already summoned to the colors and the standards of physical fitness lowered to a harsh point, made the maintenance of the armies in 1919 on a scale of 60 divisions a problem of extreme difficulty. Another 300,000 or 400,000 men shorn away would compel a melancholy contraction in the number of British divisions available for 1919, which it now seemed not unreasonable to hope would be the final and decisive year. The Cabinet therefore at the end of August sent their Commander-in-Chief a message warning him of the grave consequences which would result from a further heavy blood drain. The staff officer writes some unpleasantly turned sentences about this improper interference with the prerogatives of the High Command, and the pitiful inability of politicians to face casualties with a hearty spirit. The Cabinet acted only in accord with prudence and duty in their intervention. Nevertheless, Haig at this time held a truer view both of the deterioration of the Germans and of the resilience of his own army. He shared the military doctrines of Foch. Both these illustrious soldiers had year after year conducted with obstinacy and serene confidence offensives which we now know to have been as hopeless as they were disastrous. But the conditions had now changed. Both were now provided with offensive weapons, which the military science of neither would have conceived. The German losses in Ludendorff's attacks had affected alike the number and quality of the enemy. The swift and ceaseless inflow of the Americans turned the balance of manpower heavily in favor of the Allies. There was at last enough artillery for formidable attacks to be delivered against almost any part of the hostile line. The goddess of surprise had at last returned to the Western Front. Thus both Haig and Foch were vindicated in the end. They were throughout consistently true to their professional theories, and when in the fifth campaign of the war the facts began for the first time to fit the theories, they reaped their just reward. I was at this time so often at the front and in such agreeable relations with the headquarters, British and French, that I was able to appreciate to some extent the new conditions. Sir Douglas Haig's conviction that the British armies would continue to drive the Germans from their successive lines was intense. In his train at Frévent, in the closing stages of the Battle of Bapaume, he showed me the order he had just given for 3 British armies to attack simultaneously, and pointing to the German lines, Siegfried, Wotan, Brunhilde, Hindenburg, etc., with which the map was scored, he said, "Now you will see what all these fortifications are worth when troops are no longer resolved to defend them." I now began to do a good deal of my business at Château Verchoc. The munitions organization was working so easily that I had plenty of time to see and to think. My central problem was founded on tonnage, and its offspring, steel. The second issue was the apportionment between present needs and future preparation. Of this I was not the arbiter, but I had at least the influence which comes from the right to marshal the facts and to state the case. Like the rest of us, I was still living in the future rather than in the terrific present. But after what I had seen and learned with the armies, the future meant at the worst 1919. To make sure of winning then, if we did not win before, and to concentrate on 1919 to the deep detriment of more remote periods, seemed certainly right. The reader who now knows what actually happened and takes it all for granted may be surprised that such issues were ever balanced. But at the time we had no right to count upon a Jena collapse. Even in famine the seed corn must be preserved. On September 5 I wrote for the Cabinet as follows. To the War Cabinet, Munitions Policy. First, the extremely important paper written by the Chief of the Staff on the 25th of July, not printed here, affirms the conviction that the German armies in the West could be decisively defeated in the summer of 1919, provided that we selected a climax, concentrated every available resource upon it, and subordinated intervening events to it. The methods of mechanical attack was also set out by the General Staff, and our preparations to produce the necessary vehicles are at hand. The brilliant successes which have been gained, almost without intermission since General Wilson's paper was written, reveal the justice of the above conception, with which, I may mention, General Pétain seems to be in the most complete accord. No doubt it is right to exploit to the full the present favorable situation, and we need not exclude the possibility of results being achieved of a very far-reaching character. On the assumption, however, that these results are not decisive and that the winter closes down with an unbroken German front in the West, we ought now to have reached definite conclusions as to the character of next year's campaign. The questions involved affect directly every arrangement for munitions, supply, and manpower. All these questions can be settled harmoniously if they are related to some central design. If, for the first time, we have a definite war policy towards which every part of our organization contributes. After arguments designed to exclude any reservations in favor of 1920, I continued, Second, the policy of aiming at victory next year would appear to require, inter alia, the following measures. A. The bringing over of the largest possible number of American troops. B. In order to encourage the above, we must do our very utmost to arm, equip, and clothe them in advance of their own war industries. C. All works of construction which cannot yield a war result during the period of climax in 1919 should be rigorously pruned. D. Every effort should be made during the winter to accumulate munitions, and further releases from the munitions works should be stopped during that period. But in the early spring of 1919, large releases should again begin from the munitions works, and for this purpose our reserves of ammunition, filled and unfilled, should be decidedly drawn upon. E. From March onwards every effort should be concentrated in the shipyards on vessels nearing completion, and there should be a definite diminution in the starting of new work or of long-dated work. A substantial contribution of men from Admiralty industries of all kinds should be made in time for them to reach the field trained during the battle period. F. The release of coal miners from the mines should be renewed in the early spring, agreeably to the diminution in the output of munitions, and we should be prepared to run considerable risks in the winter of 1919 in coal supply in the effort of making victory certain. G. It should be possible for the Navy to assist during the period of the decisive battle by releasing temporarily sailors and marines to strengthen the army. There could be no better form for a naval contribution than to supply the men necessary to steer and manage, say, the last 2,000 British tanks to be completed before the battle. H. The Air Force should conform in its development to the policy of a climax, that is, all establishments in this country should be cut down to the minimum during the decisive period. The aerial home defense in all its forms should be temporarily cut down. The long periods of training and preparation which intervene between the handing over of machines and the formation of squadrons should, in regard to the last batch of squadrons that can be completed in time, be deliberately curtailed. I. The people of the country as a whole should be taught to look for a climax and work for it. They would then be found to be ready to make very great sacrifices to secure victory, even if this involved a far harder state of life than anything we have yet experienced. To the Prime Minister. Château Verchoc, September 9, 1918. Before I can make definite proposals about steel and consequently coal, I must first have the whole munitions program for 1919 worked out. And secondly, I must know what the Americans are really going to require of us. The program is now completed in draft, and I have made certain proposed reductions, the effects of which are being examined this week. I am to see the Americans in Paris on Wednesday or Thursday. When this is completed, I shall be able to provide the Cabinet with a definite basis on which any necessary decision can be taken. I have, however, been looking into the question of ammunition expenditure out here under the new conditions which the war has taken, and I regret to say that, so far from offering hopes of reductions, there is every sign of increased demand. For instance, in each of the last 2 weeks of open fighting on the wide battlefront, they have fired over 70,000 tons, and they are now asking for a daily intake of over 9,000 tons against 5,000, 6,000, and 7,000, with which we have been able to satisfy them to date. It appears that although the prolonged bombardments like Messines, etc., have been given up, the firing is now maintained by all the guns of the army over practically the whole front at once. The old limiting factor, namely the fatigue of the gunners, which imposed a certain limitation on the concentrated local operations of last year, is no longer present when all, or almost all, the batteries of the army are able to fire over the whole front. It would of course be quite impossible to continue to supply ammunition at the present rate indefinitely, and I do not think that will be demanded of us. But in view of the hopes in which I indulged when we last discussed this matter, I thought you ought to know at the earliest moment that very heavy demands, backed by very solid reasons, will come from the army for next year. In addition to this, if the prospects of a forward move mature, we shall have a largely increased demand for rails. I do not think it is impossible to satisfy both demands within reason, provided the right measures are taken, and provided the Admiralty bear their share in the consequent reductions. To a certain extent, coal can be economized if more tonnage can be given. For instance, every ton of steel I can get from the United States will save at least 4 tons of coal, and more if we use it in substitution of making steel from low-grade British ores. It is really therefore impossible for me to make definite proposals about steel and coal without hearing definitely from the shipping controller what he is going to do for us next year. All this is going forward, and I deprecate a hasty decision on any one part of the program until a general view can be taken. We are beginning these discussions much earlier this year than we did last year, and a fortnight or 3 weeks spent in getting all the cards on the table at once will certainly not be wasted. My own feeling is that there will be enough to meet all reasonable needs. There is a considerable setback here against the air. There is no doubt that the demands of the Air Force on men and material are thought to be much in excess of the fighting results produced. There is no doubt that if Haig had to choose between 50,000 men for the infantry and 50,000 men for the Air Force, he would choose 50,000 men for the infantry. The reason is not that a man in the air is not worth more than a foot soldier, but that a man in the Air Force is not a man in the air, and that from 50 to 100 men are required in the Air Force for every 1 man fighting in the air. The magnificent performances and efficiency of the squadrons cannot be accepted as the final test. Everything ought to pay a proportionate dividend on the capital invested, and it is from this point of view that the Air Force should be tested. How much flying, for instance, is done by the Royal Naval Air Service for the 45,000 first-rate fighting men and skilled men they employ? How many bombs are dropped? How many submarines are sunk? How many flights are made? How many Germans are killed for the enormous expenditure of national energy and material involved? Again, take the balloons and the airships. Let a similar test be applied to them. You really cannot afford to let any part of your organization fail in this culminating period to produce continuously war results equal to its demand on the public resources. I do not think tanks would suffer by this comparison. At any rate, I am very ready they should be subjected to it. Up to the present there have only been about 18,000 men in the tank corps, and they have only had 600 or 700 tanks to use in action. It is universally admitted out here that they have been a definite factor in changing the fortune of the field and in giving us that tactical superiority without which the best laid schemes of strategists come to naught. It is no exaggeration to say that the lives they have saved and the prisoners they have taken have made these 18,000 men the most profit-bearing we have in the army. As for the demand which tanks have made up to the present on material and skilled labor, it is indeed a very modest one. I am having graphics prepared which will illustrate these facts. It has now been settled to raise the tanks to 35,000 men. This is only about half what will be needed for the tanks I shall actually have ready by the summer of next year. Although my outputs at present are only about half what I had expected. General Els of the Tank Corps tells me that the tanks they have will see out the tank men this year. The tank men are killed and wounded in considerable numbers, and the permanent wastage of the personnel is high, whereas the tank in any victorious battle recovers very quickly from his wounds and hardly ever dies beyond the hope of resurrection. A few months' sojourn in the grave is nearly always followed by a reincarnation, so long, that is to say, as he is not snaffled by the powers of evil. Apart from the above, the fatigue on the tank crews in action is very great, and the idea of the same crew working doubled relays of tanks will certainly not carry us very far. From the above, it is clear to me that you will have large numbers of these invaluable weapons without the men to man them, and that therefore you will be faced with the need of handing over these unique products of British ingenuity, which, properly used, would give us a great influence and control over war policy, to our allies, who will not understand how to use them nearly so well as our officers and men would do. I do trust, therefore, that you will not quit the opinions which you held so strongly a few months ago, and in consequence of which preparations have already far advanced on an important scale. Although it is quite true that the Germans will develop their means of attacking tanks by anti-tank rifles as well as by field guns, landmines, etc., there are 4 new circumstances which will tend to make the tank an invaluable weapon next year. Here they are. 1. Greatly increased numbers. They will be able to afford to have a considerable proportion knocked out in each battle and yet have enough left at every point to secure success. 2. They have never yet developed smoke appliances, with which they are being fitted. Smoke as an aid to the attack, and particularly to tank attack, is only in its infancy. It is going to receive an enormous expansion next year. 3. They have never yet been used in darkness, but that was the original idea which I had when they were conceived. Hitherto they have not been capable of negotiating the accidents of ground by night, but with better tanks and a proportion, though only a proportion, of larger tanks, night operations will become possible at points where trench warfare has given place to open fighting. 4. The tactical maneuvering power of the tank and its combined training with infantry are developing fast and will yield immensely improved results. Tanks are not opposed to infantry. They are an intimate and integral part of the infantryman's strength. What has made it so difficult to develop a good policy about tanks has been the repeated shifts of opinion for and against them. Every time a new success is gained by their aid, there is an immediate clamor for large numbers. The moment the impression of that success passes away, the necessary men and material are grudged and stinted. I repeat what I said to you in my last letter, that there ought to be nearly 100,000 men in the tank corps by the time the program on which I am working by your express directions is completed. I spent yesterday on the battlefront, and guided by General Lipset of the 3rd Canadian Division, went over a large part of the ground taken by us beyond Monchy. I walked over the Drocourt-Queant line, and went on up to the extreme high water mark of our attack. I noticed several remarkable things. The Drocourt-Queant trench was strongly held with Germans, and it was a very fine, strong, deep trench. In front of it was a belt of wire nearly 100 yards broad. This wire was practically uncut and had only little passages through it, all presumably swept by machine guns. Yet the troops walked over these terrific obstacles without the wire being cut, with very little loss, killed many Germans, took thousands of prisoners and hundreds of machine guns. 300 or 400 yards behind these lines was a second line, almost as strong and more deceptive. Over this also they walked with apparently no difficulty and little loss. Behind that again, perhaps a mile farther on, were just a few little pits and holes into which German machine guns and riflemen threw themselves to stop the rout. Here our heaviest losses occurred. The troops had got beyond the support of the tanks, and the bare open ground gave no shelter. In one small space of about 300 yards wide, nearly 400 Canadian dead had just been buried, and only a few score of Germans. The moral appears to be training and tanks, short advances on enormous fronts properly organized and repeated at very brief intervals, not losing too many men, not pushing hard where there is any serious opposition except after full preparations have been made. It is the power of being able to advance a reasonable distance day after day remorselessly, rather than making a very big advance in a single day, that we should seek to develop. This power can only be imparted by tanks and cross-country vehicles on the largest scale. You would have been shocked to see the tragic spectacle of the ground where our attack for the time being withered away. It was just like a line of seaweed and jetsam which is left by a great wave as it recoils. At the end of September, General Birch, Chief of the Artillery, showed me a captured German document which greatly affected my outlook. I drew the attention of the Cabinet to it on September 26 in a note on ammunition, from which the following is an extract. There is no foundation for the view that the conditions of semi-open warfare, which have now supervened in France, and the abandonment of the prolonged artillery bombardment previous to assaults will afford us any relief in shell consumption. On the contrary, since this matter was last discussed in Cabinet, the heaviest firings yet recorded have taken place in France during a period of open warfare. For 15 successive days the expenditure exceeded 10,000 tons a day. These very wide battles, fought on the fronts of 2 or 3 British armies simultaneously, in which almost all the guns in France are employed, use more and not less ammunition than was required for the intense local fighting of Messines, Passchendaele, etc. On the other hand, this great consumption of ammunition is being attended by remarkable results. A recent order of General Ludendorff's, which has been captured, states that in a single month more than 13% of the German artillery in the West has been completely destroyed by counter-battery fire. As this method is comparatively little used by the French, the main credit of this astonishing achievement falls to the British artillery. A superior artillery supplied with ample ammunition and working in combination with a superior and highly trained air force is thus producing an immense effect, not only in destroying the enemy's power of resistance, but in saving our own men. If the destruction of German artillery could be maintained at the rate stated by General Ludendorff, it would become practically necessary to replace the whole of the German artillery in the West, apart altogether from the wear of guns, twice in the course of a year. This would be quite impossible. We are therefore in this field of effort also perhaps within measurable distance of decisive and final results. It would be disastrous if, for any reason, we were compelled to stint our gunners and ammunition at the very time when the result of all the immense efforts which have been made to increase the power and perfect the combination of our artillery and air services in coming to hand. Rather than do that, we ought to be ready to make very great sacrifices, indeed in every direction. I do not burden the reader with the further arguments about steel and tonnage, to which this extract was the prelude. It carried to my mind the first sure sign that the end was approaching, and faster than we had dared to hope.